Welcome back to my studio. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made my corset for my Sakizou Cinderella cosplay. I'll start off by saying that I drafted this pattern myself and that I will be starting this process with the corset construction and skipping over patterning and mock-up steps. For this corset, I used a yard of purple pink quilters cotton for the fashion fabric, denim for the interlining, and cotton for the lining. I used a 9-inch busk, synthetic whalebone and metal grommets, as well as ribbon for the detail. I started by cutting out the denim layer first, followed by the 2 cotton layers, and while cutting out the lining layer, I also cut 4 strips of fabric for the bias tape at 17 inches by 1.5 inches. Now I am going to pin the denim pieces to the fashion fabric all the way around the edge to prep it for flat lining. Once all the corset pieces have been pinned, I will take it to my sewing machine and baste the fabric down with a 4mm stitch length. I will repeat the flat lining process for all 14 pieces. Then back to the cutting table where I will mark each piece with the markings from my original pattern. In the reference image for this corset, the second panel from the front has what looks like a ribbon crisscross design. To create this detail, I'm using a satin ribbon and cutting short pieces to then pin on each side and have them cross over each other flat. Once I got the first cross placed, it was easier for me to duplicate it by just measuring the distance between the pieces on each side of the fabric and marking them down the fabric. This distance was 1.5 inches between each cross section. To stay consistent, I would also cut the ribbon pieces out to be the exact same size. I pinned every piece down on each side to hold it in place before bringing it to my machine to sew it down. To repeat the process on the other side, I just marked the placement of every ribbon piece on each side of the panel, and then I was able to connect the markings like you would a connect the dots type thing. To sew this ribbon down, I slowly went over each side of the panel with a 1mm stitch length. Since the ribbon was only 5/8 of an inch wide, I wanted to ensure that it would be securely sewn down, and even though a base stitch might have worked, I didn't want to risk it, so I went ahead with the 1mm. I'm going to sew the front panel that I labeled piece 1 to the side front panel that I labeled piece 2 on a 2.5mm stitch, and do the same to the lining pieces as well. I will continue to add pieces to this corset until all 7 panels have been sewn on and the lining reflects that as well. So now I should have 4 sections that are made up of 7 panels each, 2 that are the fashion fabric and 2 that are the lining. I'm going to go ahead and press all the seams open except for the panels connected to piece 2. Those seams will get pressed away from panel 2 while all the others are being pressed open. This process is repeated for all 4 fabric sections. Once my seams are pressed, I will start pinning the channels on the fashion fabric. I personally prefer to use the seam allowance as my boning channels, so I will pin the seams open and then I will take them to my machine to stitch them down at 2.5mm stitch length. This is a fairly long process and can create ripples or puckers in the top fabric, so I typically take it slow. For this corset, I pre-cut all my boning pieces to use on the mock-up, so all that was left to do was file the edges. I used synthetic whalebone for this corset, and getting a finished edge was really easy. I have an entire video on boning for corsetry that I will link in the cards, but for the purpose of this video, I just used a glass nail file and I carved on the edges so that they are more round than square. Once all the boning pieces are in their channels, it's time to move on to the busk. I used a 9-inch busk for this under bust corset, and with a 1/2 inch on both sides of the busk, I drew where my stitches would go, and then I pinned where I would not be stitching. Then on the opposite section, I pinned the lining to the fashion fabric right sides together the same way I would with measuring the busk, but instead I stitched straight down the piece with a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Now I will place the busk in between the lining and the fashion fabric, pin as close as I can to the busk, and with my zipper foot I will sew along the busk to keep it in place. Then I will use that half of the busk to mark the other half. Using my hole punch, I will punch where the notches need to go, and then I will place that half of the busk in between the two layers and pin and sew this closed with a zipper foot like I did with the first half. Once the busk is in, it's time to move to the back of the corset and create the last boning channel that is placed in between the back of the corset and the grommets. To make this, I start by pinning the lining down on the top and bottom, lining all the channels up and pinning them so they lay flat. Then at the back, I will measure 1 inch into the lining and 1 inch into the fashion fabric, and this will become my fold line. Then I will pin it down and take the entire thing over to my sewing machine so that I can stitch the top and the side and bottom at 5/8 of an inch or a 1/2 inch, whatever is most comfortable for you. Now press the back channel really good before adding the final piece of boning. Time for bias tape. On the right side of the fabric, pin the bias edge so that your binding will fold over the raw edge and can be stitched down on the back. Once the binding is pinned to the top and bottom of the corset, it's time to sew it down with a 2.5 millimeter stitch. Now I'm going to fold my binding over the edge and pin it down. Before I sew it, I actually flip over to the fashion fabric side and double check to make sure none of my basting stitches are seen. If I see any basting stitches, I will grab my seam ripper and pick them out. To sew down the binding on the inside, I use a whip stitch and I sew across the entire inside top and bottom. Finally, time for grommets. I mark my back panel every inch starting from the top and working my way down. Then I set my grommets with my grommet toolkit and a hammer, and the corset is complete. I finished the corset off with ribbon bows and a flat pearl, and then I just put it on over my chemise, and we have the base layers of my next Sakizou costume. If you liked this video, feel free to subscribe to my channel, and in the next video I will be showcasing how I made the peignet to go with this garment. See you next time, and happy sewing!